Chapter 10. As I landed in Sydney, April 26, 1995, I was thankful that David, the principal, had told me he would collect me from the airport. I realized that I didn't even have enough money to pay for the bus. I was greeted with a giant smile and a big hug. David was so happy to see me again, but he was in a rush. He was running late, and would I mind waiting a couple of hours while he finished a meeting? I didn't mind at all. He drove us to the city and parked the car. We walked down to the wharf, and he asked me to wait there. There I was, sitting by the Sydney Harbour, with no idea what that giant bridge above my head was called. I looked at it for quite a while. I then noticed the old buildings. They reminded me of England. How bizarre, I thought. I'm in Australia, but I feel as if I'm on the set for a Dickens movie. David eventually came out of his meeting. Had I enjoyed my time? Was I impressed with the Sydney Harbour Bridge? Oh, that's what it was called, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I smiled politely. It was a nice-looking bridge, but I wouldn't say I was impressed. Seeing the sun set behind the old city, the Golden Gate reflecting the light as I headed down the hill from visiting my friend on the Mount of Olives, that was impressive. The Sydney Harbour Bridge held no meaning to me. It was big. I was happy it was there, but no, I wasn't impressed. David drove me to his house in Drummoyne and introduced me to his bubbly daughter. After dinner, over a massive bowl of honey popcorn, they told me that I could sleep downstairs in the apartment that a few of the students shared. There was a spare bed, and I wouldn't need to pay for the first few days, but if I wanted to stay there, I would need to contribute to the rent. Of course, rent. I'd never had to pay for rent before. Liz had let me live in the apartment on the roof for free. I suspect my many hours in their house cleaning and cooking was my payment. It had never been discussed. In my travels, people had always opened their homes to me. This was new. Weekly rent. I had better find a job, and find one soon. I was introduced to the students downstairs. They all studied at Wesley Institute, where David was the principal and Mariana, his wife, was in charge of the theology department. I was surprised. These students, who were all going to a Christian college, they seemed so, how could I put it, not Christian. They swore. I could see empty bottles of alcohol around. They had a blank look in their eyes that I connected with the unsaved. I asked them how I would get to the city from their house. I needed to find a job. They thought that was hilarious. I had just landed, not even unpacked my bag, and I wanted to find a job. Most of them were unemployed and told me how they had tried finding work for weeks when they had arrived in Sydney. It's too hard. There are no jobs. They would lend me some money for the ferry into the city, but I shouldn't expect to find anything. I decided to wait until the next day. It was already getting late, and I was tired. There was so much to process. The next morning, I woke with a start. Something terrible was going on. There was a loud noise, and I couldn't quite place. I lay there in bed, trying to make sense of it. Something was screeching. Actually, not something. Lots of things were screeching. The sound was so intense, constant. After lying in bed, trying to identify where it might be coming from, I finally stepped outside and realized it was coming from above. The prehistoric noises were, in fact, birds. Just birds starting their day. I had never heard anything like it. Maybe at the zoo, but hearing one caged bird making an occasional sound was nothing compared to this. This was a chorus of prehistoric birds announcing to the world that another morning had started. It hit me that I was in fact on the other side of the world. After a cup of Milo, I was able to borrow some money from one of the students, and I caught the ferry into the city. I loved being back on a ferry. It reminded me of Sweden, the salty air on my face, the seagulls flying above. I breathed in deeply. I smiled as I thought of Barbara Streisand in the movie Yentl. When she eventually got on the ferry and got closer to New York, finally free, finally able to study the Bible despite being a woman. Something in me connected with her. I restrained myself and didn't break into one of her songs. I tried my best to look as numb to the world as my fellow ferry passengers. Sydney was already bustling. Businessmen and women power walking to their offices, tourists milling about, delivery boys trying to beat the morning rush. I loved it. It was thrilling. Old buildings, tall buildings, cafes. I could feel the pulse of the city. I loved that there were so many people around. I followed the throngs of people leaving Circular Quay. I didn't have a plan of where I would go. I just wanted to get a feel for my new city. I found myself walking along on Pitt Street, smiling at the people. So happy to be here. It crossed my mind that I should have possibly borrowed a bit more money. I only had the exact amount to catch the ferry in and out, not even enough to buy myself a bottle of water. I kept walking and realized that one of the buildings that I had passed was called Wesley Mission. Wait, that was also the name of my college, Wesley Institute for Ministry and the Arts. I wondered if there was a connection. Funny how two things would share a name like that. I retraced my steps and walked into the fancy foyer. There was a bookstore right inside the entrance, and a bit further down there was a cafeteria-style restaurant. It seemed nice and relaxed. I asked one of the waiters if there was a manager I could talk to. Michael was busy, but if I could wait, he would chat to me later. Eventually, I met with him. He wasn't much older than me and very friendly. I told him that I was looking for a job, and he explained that there really wasn't anything available. What about in the bookshop? My dad owned a bookstore in Jerusalem, and I had some experience with that. Was I from Jerusalem? Michael assumed from my accent that I was from the States. Yes, I'm from Jerusalem. How long had I been here? Oh, I arrived yesterday, and I would really like a job because I'm going to be studying at the Wesley Institute. Michael looked somewhat surprised and smiled. He told me he would put my name on the books. He would find me some shifts. If I could buy myself a white shirt and black pants and some black shoes, he would provide an apron. I was in. He then offered for me to stay for a free lunch. That night when I had dinner with David and Mariana, they just laughed when I told them my story. They knew things were going to work out for me. They just hadn't realized how quickly. Now that I had already had a job sorted, I might as well come into the college and look around. I wasn't going to start until the second semester in July, but they wanted me to meet the lecturers and get a feel for the place. The next day we drove to the college. It was such a short drive. Why would we not walk? It would have only taken 25 minutes or so. When we got there, David took me around and introduced me. He seemed very proud to have a real Israeli joining his beloved group of students. He made sure to mention that I came from Jerusalem and that I had been in the Air Force. I could tell that everyone adored David. He genuinely seemed to care about all the students, and he would ask about their families and follow up on concerns that they may have had. I stayed with him throughout the morning. His secretary was a bit concerned that nothing had been done about an upcoming fundraiser they wanted to have. An autumn bush dance that wouldn't be able to go ahead. My ears pricked up. Did they want me to organize the bush dance? I had plenty of time. I could easily do it between my shifts at work. I was happy to take it on. They were thrilled, but was I sure? It was a big job. It involved a barbecue. Would I really be able to do that? I had just arrived 2 days earlier. Sure, I said. I've got no problem with that at all. Just one thing. What exactly is a bush dance? I had never heard of it before, and I needed them to explain it to me. David just laughed and shook his head. Who was this girl from Jerusalem? A couple of days later, I presented David with the details. I had called around a few places. I hadn't realized how far away they were, but when they had heard that I didn't have a car, they were happy to deliver most of the items. I had a butcher donating sausages, a bakery that would donate 2 crates of bread. Schweppes were more than happy to give us drinks for the occasion. It wouldn't cost the college a cent to feed everyone. Not just that, I had asked the students that I was living with if they could help out. Most of them were studying music at the college, and they were happy to organize the playlist for the night and make sure they had the sound system worked out. They even organized someone who could call out the dances, whatever that meant. Problem solved. I didn't understand why no one else had offered to help. David and Mariana took me under their wing. I really loved being grafted into their family. The rent downstairs was too expensive for me, though. I knew I needed to set money aside to pay for my school fees that were looming. A couple at the evening church that David and Mariana went to had asked if they knew a student who was good with kids. They needed someone who could give them a hand and live at their house and do some chores in exchange for a bed. It sounded perfect. They lived right across from the harbor, so I would be able to take the ferry across to the city for my shifts at Wesley Mission. I said yes before I even met them. As it turned out, they still wanted me to pay for my bed. Quite a lot. Australians' view of money was so new to me. Christian Australians' view of money, to be precise. They didn't seem to see their money in a communal way and that it was there to be shared. Here were these 2 lawyers living in one of the most expensive spots in Sydney, and they wanted me to pay a lot of money so I could sleep at their house and look after their kids. Thankfully, I was getting more shifts at Wesley Mission, and I also liked the mother. She had a sadness in her eyes. She seemed to be drowning in her role as a mom and a lawyer, a balancing act that never quite worked. Either her clients missed out or her kids. She couldn't do both. We spent a lot of time talking with her, sharing from her heart. I was out of my depth, but I knew that she valued our chats. After a couple of months of this, I was finally ready to move into a student house that belonged to the school. My studies were about to begin, and I needed to be closer to the college in Drummoyne. David took me around to the different houses to see if there was a spot for me. I was introduced to a few of the girls that lived in one of the houses. David seemed disappointed. The girl that he had really wanted me to meet wasn't there. David let out a big sigh. He obviously had a very soft spot for Alice. He explained to me while standing in the doorway to her empty room that Alice had come from Adelaide to study music at the college. She had the voice of an angel. In fact, she was an angel. He knew that we would get along. Unfortunately, I was told there was no spare room at the house. David had misunderstood. So he took me to another house in Five Dock where I ended up renting with 6 other students. They all seemed pretty bizarre to me, except for one, Amy. She'd only arrived a few months earlier from Tasmania. Despite being only 18, she fit into the category of salt of the earth. Her integrity shone through her massive smile and her bright eyes. I was thrilled to hear that we would be studying theology together. Amy became my trusted friend. She helped me ground myself those first few weeks. I knew that I was so different to anyone she'd ever met before. I knew that she was intimidated by my story, and she felt as if her quiet life in Tasmania could never measure up to my stories from Jerusalem. She had no idea that I was in fact intimidated by her strength, her clarity, her mind. I felt safe in her presence and looked forward to our early morning walks to the college. I loved studying theology. It was the perfect fit for me. I had so many questions, so many things that didn't make sense. Thankfully, my lecturer, Dr. Harley, didn't mind my constant comments and interruptions. He didn't mind being challenged. He took me aside one day and said he had never quite had a student like me. He felt that when he stepped into our class, it would transform into yeshiva. He became the rabbi, and I was the student who would argue back and forth. He loved it and delighted in my questions. Thankfully, the rest of the classmates didn't seem to mind, and I had hours and hours to try and get my head around concepts that I just couldn't seem to grasp. Most of my classmates were guys who looked like they were suffering a slow death having to be there. I never quite understood why they bothered. One classmate who stood out, though, and who I quickly aligned myself with, was Kate. Kate was larger than life. Her laugh filled the room. She came from the western suburbs of Sydney, and she had the sharpest mind I had ever come across. She knew everything. Every little piece of trivia, she knew it, and she loved to pass that knowledge on. She was also hilarious, which helped balance out all the boring guys in the class. With Amy on one side and Kate on the other, I couldn't be happier. I had Dr. Harley to harass about my deep questions about God. Why was God referred to in the plural in the Hebrew? And he explained that it symbolized that God was in fact 3, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. No, I thought, that's not it. It's deeper than that. It didn't sit right with me. My dad had never been able to answer me either. Now Dr. Harley was disappointing me as well. The answer remained elusive. One of the great things about Kate was that she had answers for everything. Well, maybe not the answers to the theological questions I had, but she knew everything else. She taught me about Australian pop culture, Australian authors, TV shows that she felt that I should know about. Kate was also married. Unlike me and Amy, who were possibly the 2 most sexually ignorant females in Sydney, or at least that's how it felt. Kate was more than happy to share her experiences. Every so often she would arrive in class and say something about not having slept that night because of all the wild sex she had with her husband. Amy and I were both stunned and shocked that she was so open and that she had no shame. It was completely new to me, but also so refreshing. Whatever she said was always followed by a giant laugh. After a couple of months of this, I finally mustered up the courage to ask her something that had been laying heavy on my heart. I was about to turn 21. My birthday was just around the corner. I really needed a question answered, and Kate was exactly the person who'd be able to explain it to me. What exactly was sex? How did it work? Could she, step by step, explain the process to me? We were sitting outside the college building eating lunch. Kate's eyes popped open. How could I not know? I was 20 and didn't know about sex. Amy was sitting there next to us nodding. I was pretty sure she didn't know anything either. Kate was ready to fill us in and happy to pollute our minds with her sordid stories. What did I want to know? Okay, here was the thing. No matter how much I thought about it, I just couldn't understand how a husband and wife could be lying in their bed, dressed in their pajamas one minute, and then the next they would be naked and the man inside the woman. I didn't get it. I couldn't see what took place in those moments before it happened. How did you go from fully dressed to having sex? What was said? How did things fit? What exactly was put where? Could Kate, please, bit by bit, explain it all to me? Thankfully, she did. Over the next hour, she sat there and graphically told us every little detail. I got her to go over the bits again. But wait, the penis actually gets hard? Like hard? How can it go in then? And wouldn't it break? Oh, it bends. Right. It bends. It's hard, but it bends. Things were becoming clearer. I was still struggling with the concept of those pajamas being taken off, but in my mind's eye, the room was dark and all the clothes would be safely back on by the time the sun rose. I was so grateful. Kate had done what no one had been able to do before. She had explained to me the mechanics of sex without me dying of embarrassment. Her relaxed take on life and her desire to pass on knowledge was the perfect combination for me. I finally knew what having sex was. What a relief. I seriously doubted I would ever experience it for myself because, after all, it did involve my body, but at least I would have a better understanding of what more and more of my friends were up to. My 21st birthday happened to fall right in the middle of my exam timetable. It felt wrong to get my new friends to come along to a celebration. I didn't really like birthday parties anyways. They always felt so clumsy. I wanted to do something though. It was a Sunday and I felt as if the milestone needed to be acknowledged. I didn't have much money to spare and I counted out what was in my wallet and there was enough for something special. So I headed to the shops and I bought a baguette because my parents always shared a baguette on special occasions. A can of salmon because it was cheaper than the smoked salmon that reminded me of New Year's Eve with Mormon warfare, an avocado to remind me of Israel, and a pineapple to highlight that I was in Australia. It was the perfect combination. I was so pleased my money had stretched so far. But where should I eat it? I had to be in the city for the evening church service at the Wesley Mission. Of course, I would take the ferry into the city and go and sit on the steps of the Opera House. And that's exactly what I did. My 21st birthday was celebrated with a solo picnic on the steps of the Opera House with tourists giving me weird looks as I happily ate my baguette and cut up my pineapple. It felt good. It felt right. I was acknowledging parts of me that made me who I am. Sure, it would have been nice to spend the day with my friends, but there were so many important people in my life that wouldn't be able to be there. So in a way, it was just easier to do it on my own. Once I finished, I packed up my things and headed off to the church service. Dr. Moyes, who at the time was the head of the Wesley Mission, always liked to come and say hello to me. David had warned him that I had a tendency to say things that were quite shocking, and Dr. Moyes seemed to enjoy my frankness. I didn't disappoint. I always had a story for him about something that had happened in my travels. Tonight, he came up to me as usual and asked me how I was. I told him that I had just celebrated my 21st birthday. He congratulated me and asked me what I'd done for the big day. I told him about my perfect moment on the steps of the Opera House and how nice it was to sit in the sun and eat my food. I had a big smile on my face that wasn't matching the face in front of me. Dr. Moyes' eyes were starting to well up with tears. Had I really just spent my 21st birthday alone? Had I really no one to celebrate with? I tried to explain to him that I didn't need more than that. The day had been acknowledged, not according to Dr. Moyes. He was wiping tears from his face and told me that no one should ever celebrate their birthday alone, especially not at 21st. The service was about to start. It was broadcast on radio, so he had to rush off. I was touched by Dr. Moyes' concern for me. It felt nice to have someone care so much. Once the service had started and the singing had stopped, Dr. Moyes explained that he had a special visitor tonight. He wanted everyone to meet someone very precious. It took me a little while to realize that the person he was talking about in front of the church as well as on the radio was in fact me. He wanted me to come up to the microphone and share about my life a bit. And then he got everyone to sing happy birthday to me. It was a very sweet moment, and he was right. Birthdays are not meant to be spent on your own. After the service, a little man approached me. He had a certain look about him. He reminded me of Mr. Bean. He wanted to congratulate me on the big occasion and wish me a good year. He had always wanted to travel to the Holy Land, but any spare time he had, he would fly to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka? Why did he fly there? He explained that he had become involved in an orphanage and tried to help them whenever he could. Did he go alone or in a group? He traveled alone, just something he liked to do to add some meaning to his very mundane life as a business owner. Would he like someone to go with him next time? I had lots of experience with kids, and I had done puppet ministry. I had worked at summer camps, and I knew lots of fun songs and games that kids loved. Could I come with him? Would he mind if I tagged along? I would find the money somehow. I always did. Mr. Bean wasn't so sure. He explained that Sri Lanka was in the middle of a civil war and that it was too dangerous for him to go there. The part of the country that the orphanage was in was in Tamil region. Had I heard of the Tamil Tigers? A terrorist group? No, I hadn't. I'd never heard of the Tamil Tigers, but I had lots of friends in the PLO and they were really friendly, and terrorists had a nice side and they didn't scare me. Could I please come along? Mr. Bean needed to think about it and he would get back to me. A couple of weeks later, he approached me after church. He really couldn't see me coming along. He had spoken to some people and it just wasn't safe. It wasn't safe for anyone, but especially a young woman. And the roads were now closed and there were checkpoints along the whole way. Only church workers were allowed through. What if I dressed up as a nun? Would he be okay with that? I could easily find some clothes that would pass as a nun. I already had a big olive wooden cross from my dad's bookstore. I could find the rest. Please, I would really like to go. And if I could survive Jerusalem, I could survive Sri Lanka. Mr. Bean smiled. I think he realized that he had no say in this. I was going to join him and he might as well just accept it. He wanted to know about my parents. How would they feel? My parents? How would they feel about what? Of course they would be fine with it. I had already gone to Australia. You couldn't get any further than that. My parents would be fine. I would let them know in my next fax that I was going to Sri Lanka. The summer holidays were coming up, and I managed to score another job. The busiest Christian bookstore in Sydney was happy for me to work in their cafe. Coorong was one of those bookstores when you step inside, you're convinced that you've landed in America. The scented candles, the endless self-help books, the cheesy wall hangings, it made Christians feel good to go there and gave them an oasis from the secular world. It apparently made them feel closer to God. Not me. I hated it. It gave me a rash. I was pretty sure I was allergic to all things Christian paraphernalia. It was just so distant to the God that I knew from Jerusalem. It was a job, though, and I needed the money. I was a waitress, and I was good at what I did, except for one minor issue, my accent. My annoying accent. It was always there, always present. Even if I said tomato sauce instead of ketchup, the accent was there to trigger a response. I could see the look in the customer's eyes. I knew the question was coming. I started handing out the menus without saying anything, so at least the barrage of questions could come after they had decided on what they were eating. But then it would come, the dreaded question. Are you American? No. Oh, sorry, Canadian, of course. How rude of me. No, I'm not American, and no, I'm not Canadian. I was born in Sweden, but I grew up in Israel. Israel? Really? I have always wanted to go to Israel. Or my uncle went to Israel last year. He loved it. He sent me a postcard from the Dead Sea. And on they would go, chatting to me like I was there to hear everything and anything to do with the Holy Land. They could sit in their holy cafe in their holy bookstore and talk to a waitress from the Holy Land. The full experience. I was giving them a moment of glory. My manager didn't seem to share these warm, fuzzy feelings. I was taking too long at each table. My orders weren't coming in quickly enough, and customers were staying too long and taking up too many tables that could be used for new orders. I had to stop. I couldn't talk to my customers about my private life. It was impossible. There was no way I could stop the barrage of questions without making the bookshop look bad by saying that I was banned from answering. What was I going to do? I needed this job. I needed the money. I had school fees to pay off. I had rent coming up, and soon a trip to Sri Lanka. The answer came in the form of a business card. I had them printed out at a local shop. I'm not American. I was born in Sweden, but grew up in Jerusalem. Please don't ask me more during work hours. I handed these cards out to customers just as I saw their eyes registering that I sounded funny. It meant that I could stop the onslaught of questions before they started and focus on my job. Just before that first question came out, the business card was handed to the customer and I was able to get back to my job. My manager wasn't quite sure what to make of it, but was happy to have a fast flow of customers again. The new school year was starting and I was able to move into the college dorm that was right behind the post office in Leichhardt. David offered me the first choice of a room. I was happy to have the last room down the corridor, the one right above where the mail was delivered to the post office each morning. I loved mail and I loved receiving letters. Being able to look out my window and see all the bags of mail made me happy. I didn't mind the early morning noise. I was pleased to see that Alice, the singer that David had wanted me to meet, was going to have one of the rooms in my dorm as well. I had seen her around the campus. We hadn't really spent much time together. I had heard her sing, though, and I knew she had a giant Fijian boyfriend. But that was pretty much it. Her friend Shirin was also moving in. Shirin was studying music alongside Alice. Shirin was Italian, and I knew instantly that we would get along. The mood in the house was good. I was really happy about the different people sharing my space. It was an eclectic group, and being the first one to move in put me in the role of mother of the house, a role I always seemed to find for myself. I started to get to know Alice and visited her in her room. She told me how she grew up in Adelaide, very much part of the church. When she finished school, she had gone to Romania, where she had wanted to help out with orphans. The stories of what she saw there were still haunting her. She told me about her Fijian boyfriend, how she'd always thought she would marry a black man. As I listened to her, I felt as if I already knew her. She seemed so familiar. Her story resonated with me, and I felt a connection. We spoke a similar language. She also saw symbols in life and drew meaning from them. She also desired to know the truth, and she could see people's hearts and go beyond their words. I sat there on her bed, watching her face, and I knew that I had made a new friend, more than a friend. I could see a similar glint in her eyes that reminded me of Johanna. Her devotion triggered memories of Danya in Jerusalem. I knew that she was going to be my friend for life, whether she wanted to or not. My studies and my work took up most of my week. I tried to find as much time as possible to hang out with my dorm mates, but I also wanted good grades. I really enjoyed my new friendships, and I was starting to accept how different my Aussie friends were from those I had left behind in Jerusalem. Dr. Harley's class was still enjoyable, so was Mariana's class. She wasn't really teaching me anything new, but I enjoyed her style. I liked how she presented the Bible to my classmates who seemed to know so little about the Bible despite calling themselves Christian. One day, Mariana said something that shook me to the core. She hadn't intended to. She was just trying to explain the song about the river of Babylon, how the Jews sat down and wept as they were held captive because they could no longer be in Zion where they belonged. She explained how it was more than that, though. The Jews really felt like they could only serve their God within the boundaries of their country. Now that they were captive in Babylon, they didn't have access to him anymore. They needed to return to Zion in order to worship their God again and to be in union with him. She explained how wrong they were. We can have access to God anywhere. We're not bound by countries or location. God is everywhere. We have access to him no matter where we call him from. The tears started to roll down my cheeks. I tried to wipe them away because I didn't want to cause a scene, but I knew that she was wrong. I knew that the Jews in Babylon were right. They were weeping into the river because they knew, just like I knew, that God remained in Jerusalem. I had lost contact with him. The God I served was only accessible through my community back home. The American God and now the Australian God held no meaning to me. I had been running on near empty since leaving Jerusalem. I'd been running on fuel that had been stored up for my years of devotion with my youth group, but now it was running out. My tank was nearly empty. I was barely surviving on fumes. What would be left once it was empty? Who would I be without my connection to God? It was just about this time that Paul Meyer came to speak at our college. He's the author of the popular book, The 5 Love Languages. He'd been invited to speak to the counseling students at the school, but us theologians were invited as well. It was a 3-day course. I sat there listening to him and I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to study counseling. All this theology was driving me crazy. It was an inward spiral that led nowhere. I needed a practical outlet. I needed to find a way for me to use my knowledge in a way that could help people in a practical way. I decided to stay behind after the sessions. It turned out that Paul knew quite a few people from Israel. He had met with them hoping to start up a clinic in Israel. Listening to him, I knew I wanted to be part of that. He knew the girl from my school, Karen's parents, who had the counseling center. It felt good to have that connection. I imagined being able to return to Israel with a degree in counseling and be part of the solution over there. I wanted to be part of the reconciliation between Jews and Arabs. I wanted to facilitate dialogue. I wanted to meet with families who were suffering in silence like my family had been. As the months passed, I felt more and more uncomfortable at the college. I had always struggled with institutions, and I was now not just studying in one, I was also living in one at the dorm, having to follow the rhythm of the day that someone else decided for me. It was getting too much. My head felt like it was going to implode. The communal meals were starting to resemble a mental institution. How were we any different? One evening, it all got too much. As I sat there eating my meal, I slowly started smearing the food on my face, spoonful after spoonful. The noisy room became silent as everyone sat and stared at me. Initially, people had laughed, but as I continued, it started to freak them out. I had lost the plot. Their happy mother, who was always looking after them, had lost her mind. She was smearing herself with food without any expression on her face. It was a weird moment, a very weird moment. It was exactly how I felt, though. I was losing my mind, being stuck there, and I wasn't exactly sure how to break out. A few days later, the feeling came over me again, this time when I was at the college. I was sitting outside with some friends. To me, their conversation sounded so inane, so repetitive and mindless. I craved my friends from home. I missed the intensity of our dialogue. This Aussie way of talking was so empty and shallow. I just lay down on the asphalt. I lay there for ages, perfectly still. I looked like a corpse, as if I was the center of a crime scene. Someone grabbed a piece of chalk and drew an outline around my body. It was official. I was dead. I had nothing more in me. I knew my time in Sydney was up. My trip to Sri Lanka was around the corner. Mr. Bean had just organized the tickets for us, and we were going to leave in a couple of weeks. I had faxed Danya in Jerusalem about the trip and told her I was going to an orphanage. Danya had finished her army service and had been chosen as the best soldier in Israel. She had given so much and now needed something totally different to do. Could she come with me? I was overjoyed. Danya, my closest friend from Jerusalem, who I adored. She was so similar to me in that she loved knowledge, and just like me, she was a tomboy. Other than that, we differed. Danya was gorgeous and good at everything she did. She was an incredible piano player. Her voice could make her famous if she chose. She had the world at her fingertips, and she had chosen to go to Sri Lanka with me. I knew we would make great nuns together, and I was counting the days for the departure. During this time, I had become closer to Alice and her boyfriend. He, in turn, had introduced me to his friend Joelle. According to Alice, Joelle was interested in me. I was shocked. A guy interested in me? Joelle would come over when Alice was seeing her boyfriend, and we would all hang out in Alice's room together. Joelle was also Fijian. He was very shy and incredibly kind. The fact that he liked me was intriguing. The thought of having a boyfriend was exciting. I had only ever had Steve the surfer as a boyfriend. It had been so intense and profound and meaningful. I wasn't sure if I could do that again. Something light-hearted and fun, though, that seemed doable. I had Alice tell Joelle that I was keen. I explained to Joelle that I was happy to be his girlfriend. However, and it was a big however, my relationship with God came first. If I ever felt that him being my boyfriend would possibly distract me from God, then I would end things straight away. Joelle thought that was fair enough and agreed to this very serious arrangement. We only had a few weeks together before I was flying to Sri Lanka. One night we were kissing, and Joelle made the critical mistake of placing his hand on my stomach. My stomach. My stomach was totally out of bounds. I gently removed his hand from my stomach and continued to kiss. Something bothered me, though. I had enjoyed the feel of his hand. It had made my body respond in a way that I wasn't used to. Oh no, it hit me like a lightning bolt. This is how girls get pregnant. It starts with enjoying a hand on his stomach, and next thing we would be having sex. I sat straight up, and I told Joelle I wanted to go home. He lived in Bondi, so it was a long taxi ride back to Leichhardt. He looked pretty confused the whole ride back. What had he done? Why did I want to leave so soon? I got home and had a shower. As soon as I knew the taxi would have dropped him back home, again, I went out to the payphone on the street. It was the middle of the night by now. I called him up and then very calmly explained to him that he was a lovely man and that I really liked him. He had been so kind and generous, but he had come between me and God. He was a distraction. I could no longer be his girlfriend. It was over. I didn't even give him a chance to respond. I just hung up the phone and went to my room, hoping to get a couple of hours of sleep before classes began. Alice's mother was coming to stay for a few days. She was a lecturer in Adelaide, but was spending time in Sydney. Despite her incredibly sharp mind, she was very easy to talk to. I shared with her that I was struggling with the lack of an outlet with my theology, and that I really felt as if counseling would be better suited for me. Her face lit up. If I wanted to study counseling, she knew just the place. The college that she worked for in Adelaide was offering a fantastic program, the best in the country. I should go there. I could transfer my credits from the theology course and go straight into a counseling degree. It sounded good. In fact, it was a perfect fit. But just one thing. Could she show me on a map where Adelaide was, because I had no idea. I told Alice's mother that I was off to Sri Lanka, but I would look into tickets to Adelaide before my departure. I went out that day and spoke with a travel agent. She told me that they had a special to Adelaide. It wouldn't cost that much, but I would have to book that day. The ticket was refundable, so I might as well buy it. I could always get my money back if I changed my mind. I then packed my bag for Sri Lanka. Thankfully, I wouldn't need to dress in a habit in order to pass as a nun. I just needed a long black skirt, a long sleeve white shirt, a black cardigan, and a giant wooden cross. My hairstyle already resembled a nun, so I didn't have to make any changes there. I took the bus to the airport and met Mr. Bean. I was ready for my next adventure.